Thanks for tuning into my talk. The subject of my presentation is a woman named Sarah Anne Curzon. These days, there are a lot of people who have probably never heard of her, and yet during her life, she was a leading Canadian journalist, poet, author, and activist for women's rights. During my presentation today, I'm going to try to describe some of her accomplishments and share some of her writings. But I also want to use her life story to illustrate what life in Toronto and Canada was like in the second half of the 1800s, both for people in general and especially for women, the women's rights movement. Sarah Anne Curzon was born in 1833 near Birmingham in England. She was originally Sarah Anne Vincent. Of course, her parents were George and Mary Vincent. Her father, George Vincent, was a successful upper middle class glass manufacturer. So any prosperity that the Vincent family enjoyed was fired in the glass kilns that George Vincent owned in his Birmingham factory. But biographical information suggests that George Vincent took an active interest in his daughter Sarah's intellectual development. He was a devoted family man who spent time with his children, read to them, and talked with them about all the big issues of the day. When Sarah Anne Vincent was growing up in Birmingham in the 1830s and 1840s, she was educated by private tutors and then at a girls' school in the city. Although we don't know a lot about her early life in England, we do know that she started publishing her written work while she was still a young woman. These writings included poetry and short fiction for an English periodical called Leisure Hour, which was published out of London by an evangelical Christian organization called the Religious Tract Society. Leisure Hour magazine emphasized a lot of the philosophies that the women's rights movement would embrace even here in Canada in the second half of the 1800s. Sarah Anne Vincent would eventually embrace a lot of these philosophies too. The magazine's title, Leisure Hour, referred to the social activism campaigns that had helped bring in shorter working hours and therefore more leisure time for the working class. But the magazine also emphasized religious Christian literature that was meant to be read at home in a wholesome traditional family setting. The pages of the Leisure Hour magazine were sometimes filled with moralistic articles for the working class that reinforced the virtues of family life and staying at home on Sunday, the Christian Sabbath, for a day of rest. This kind of morality was later adopted by Sarah Anne Vincent too, although she became a strong advocate for women's suffrage, the rights of women to vote, to own property, and even to attend university. She also sometimes spoke of how women could help shape their country by staying at home, taking care of their husbands, and raising their children. In fact, Vincent once spoke of homemaking as a peculiarly feminine form of nation building. Curzon acknowledged that in the second half of the 1800s, it was men who marched on the battlefield or went into parliament or became barristers and judges. But she felt that women could have a powerful influence as wives and mothers. This may seem at odds with the champion for women's rights that Sarah Anne Vincent would eventually become, but she realized that 160 years ago now, many people regarded a woman's place as in the home. So in some cases, the home was where a woman could exercise the most power. Sarah Anne's early life in Birmingham was, of course, just the beginning. She started out with a comfortable middle-class upbringing. Thanks in part to her father, she was well-educated and curious, and her early work and writing would lead her to a lifelong crusade for women's rights and other social activism that was carried out in a large part through words on a page. For now, let's move on to the next chapter in her life. In 1858, Sarah Anne Vincent became Sarah Anne Curzon when she married her husband, Robert Curzon. 4 years later, in 1862, the couple left England and settled in Toronto. Sarah Anne Curzon mostly stayed in Toronto for just over 35 years until she died here in 1898. But what was Toronto like during those 35 years? This painting of Toronto in 1854 gives us just a hint of the Victorian metropolis that Toronto was growing into. Just like so many other historical characters, Curzon's identity, her writing, her activism, and her attitudes on life itself were shaped by the place and the time that she now called home. Toronto was going through a boom in industry, technology, and science, just as Sarah Anne Curzon and her husband arrived here in 1862. An engineering company called Armstrong, Beer and Heim had taken the very first photographs of Toronto just a few years earlier, about 1857. Overall, these photographs show us what a mixed city Toronto was. There was a certain abrupt squalor to some of the city's homes and shops, although church spires punctuated the skyline at pretty frequent intervals. These first photographs gives us a fascinating glimpse into what Toronto was like just before the Curzons arrived here in 1862. The city did have an emergent retail district that stretched along King Street east towards Church Street. These couple of blocks served as Toronto's main retail district through most of the 1800s. And higher education was just starting to show signs of future promise in Toronto at this time. This is the University of Trinity College building that opened on Queen Street West in 1852. It was a bastion of conservative teaching and Church of England theology, whose halls were only open to young men. But in the years to come, Sarah Anne Curzon would set her sights on establishing equality in education. But there was something else underneath the veneer of Victorian respectability that these old photographs and paintings seem to show us. A lot of people were left out or unrepresented in all the growth and progress that was taking place in Toronto in the second half of the 1800s. There had always been an upper class in Toronto filled with a few wealthy families and government officials who had nearly unchecked power over the population. But by the 1860s, Toronto also had a growing middle class. Sarah Anne Curzon and her husband Robert were part of that middle class, but there was also an underclass. This underclass dwelt in marginal conditions thanks to inadequate pay or downright unemployment or chronic illness or age or poverty. All the social services that we now take for granted in the early 21st century were still in their infancy. In fact, they were so scarce as to be practically unavailable for many, many people. Employment conditions were often deplorable, with workers forced into unregulated, unfair, and unsafe working conditions. So by the late 1860s, workers began banding together to form unions and to fight for equality. The Canadian labor movement began to organize itself soon after Sarah Anne Curzon and her husband arrived in Toronto in 1862. Meanwhile, the struggle for women's rights was also on the rise at the same time. In fact, the labor movement, which called for better working hours, higher pay, and the right to strike, was often interwoven with the women's rights movement, which called for the more equitable treatment of women, but also demanded reforms that would improve the lives of children while advancing public health and social conditions. All those moral crusades that sought to wipe out the hardships of poverty and end the indignities of the prisons and the workhouses started at just about the point when Sarah Anne Curzon moved to Toronto. She went on to play a pivotal role in the changing city. Sarah Anne Curzon may have been influenced by the societal inequities that she found in Toronto when she moved here in 1862, but over the next 35 years, she helped to address those inequities as well. The life that Sarah Anne Curzon had known back in England, that is the life of a financially comfortable middle-class intellectual, continued once she was here in Toronto. As the Curzons found economic stability here in their new city, Sarah Anne was able to return to writing poetry, drama, and essays, just as she had done in her youth back in England. Curzon contributed to several Canadian periodicals, including the Canadian Monthly and National Review, The Week, Grip, and the Canadian Magazine, all of which were based in Toronto. She also wrote for Dominion Illustrated, which was a magazine published out of Montreal, and she was also published in British and American newspapers. A lot of the publications that Sarah Anne Curzon wrote for were published in the years immediately following Canadian Confederation. In some ways, this was a good time for Canadian publications. There was a nationalistic movement to promote Canadian authors and Canadian literature. But there were challenges too. A lot of the periodicals at the time were biased and were basically mouthpieces for one political party or the other. While newspapers like the Globe spoke out for Liberals, the Toronto Standard and others like it supported the Conservatives. These were acrimonious years in Canadian politics, and there were bitter public arguments between George Brown, who was considered the father of Canada's Liberal Party, and Sir John A. Macdonald, who was Canada's Conservative Prime Minister from Confederation in 1867 through most of the 1870s and 1880s. One of the magazines that Curzon wrote for was called Grip. Published over 20 years between 1873 and 1894, it was a political satire magazine that was praised for its total independence from any Canadian political party. Grip was a political platform, but it kept its neutrality by criticizing every political party. Sarah Anne Curzon found success in the pages of Grip magazine. Its readers were responsive to her message, and the magazine would sponsor some of her later works, which I will talk about a little later in my presentation. But Curzon also showed what a patriotic Canadian she had grown into too, by contributing to so many of these publications. She was a nationalistic Canadian who used her writing as a way to push her own ideals for what kind of country she thought Canada should grow into. In 1881, Curzon became assistant editor of a magazine called The Canada Citizen. She wrote a regular column on women's issues for the paper, which had one of the first women's pages in Canada. The women's page was a section devoted to covering news that the publisher thought would be of interest to female readers. Now, this was kind of a mixed accomplishment. By having a women's page, publishers were basically segregating their readers by gender by assuming that women were either disinterested or completely incapable of understanding any news that was meant for a man. But I suppose at least they were finally acknowledging that a woman might actually want to pick up a newspaper and read it in between taking care of their husbands and children, of course. By this point, in the early 1880s, Sarah Anne Curzon was earning praise for her work as both a journalist and as a woman's advocate. One biographer has named her a pioneer in educating readers about female suffrage, property rights equal to men, and access to higher education for women. But Sarah Anne Curzon did more than just write about equality for women. She became a founding member of the Toronto Suffrage Association, as well as the later organizations that grew out of it. But what were the main objectives that these women's groups struggled for? Well, there were three big ones that most of us still associated with the early suffragette movement today. These were the right to vote, the right to attend university, and the right to own property. Of these three, Sarah Anne Curzon became most involved in a woman's right to attend university. Curzon supported the efforts of this woman, Dr. Emily Howard Stowe, who was considered another great Toronto area leader of the Canadian women's rights movement. Stowe is best known as the first woman doctor to practice medicine in Canada. In 1865, Stowe was denied entrance into the Toronto School of Medicine at the University of Toronto. She was told by the Reverend John McCall, the school's vice principal, that the doors of this university are not open to women, and I trust they never will be. Stowe persisted, though, and in 1867, she obtained a degree in the United States from the New York Medical College for Women. Stowe eventually came back to Canada. She opened a medical practice on Richmond Street here in Toronto and published advertisements like this one. The ad references how Stowe specialized in treating diseases in women and children. In 1870, the president of the Toronto School of Medicine finally relented and gave special permission to Emily Stowe and her fellow student, Jenny Kidd Trout, to attend classes at the University of Toronto. They faced down a lot of hostility from male faculty and other students, all of whom were also men. But both women refused to give up. In 1875, Jenny Kidd Trout became the first woman in Canada to receive a medical license. And in 1880, Emily Stowe became the second woman in Canada to receive a medical license. These days, Emily Stowe and Jenny Kidd Trout are better known examples of the fight for female equality, but Sarah Anne Curzon was a staunch ally. In June of 1883, Dr. Emily Stowe led a group of her fellow members at the Toronto Women's Suffrage Club. Sarah Anne Curzon was among these supporters. Together, these women proclaimed that medical education for women is a recognized necessity, and consequently, facilities for such instruction should be provided. 4 months later, on October the 1st, 1883, Toronto's Mayor A.R. Boswell formally opened the Women's Medical College at 289 Sumac Street. This is a sketch of the building. Emily Stowe often gets a lot of the historical credit, but Sarah Anne Curzon raised a lot of awareness for the cause through her writing. In the past 140 years since the Women's Medical College first opened in 1883, the institution has grown and evolved into the Women's College Hospital that we know today. So far as I've been able to discover, Curzon never forced her way into a classroom the way that Emily Stowe or Jenny Kidd did, but she did establish herself as an intellectual. She accomplished this through her writing and her role as an author of all those articles in various journals and magazines and newspapers. She made a name for herself as one of Toronto's leading women's rights activists, but she also wrote a lot about the history of Toronto and Canada. When Curzon first moved to Toronto back in 1862, she was shocked to hear some educated Canadians remark that Canada had no history. This inspired another facet of Curzon's writings. She turned into writing about history. A lot of her articles recounted the stories of early pioneers, colonialists, and loyalists. She was actively trying to awaken a sense of patriotism that she associated with good citizenship, national development, and even women's rights. So by the late 1870s, Sarah Anne Curzon had earned a reputation as an expert in Ontario's historical movement. No, she never forced her way into a lecture hall, but she was frequently invited to speak before predominantly male audiences. They came to hear her discourse on history. But two of her greatest and best remembered works used the framework of Canadian history to convince her audiences as to why women should be allowed to go to university, why they should be considered just as capable as men, and why they should be given gender equality. Now, I'd like to talk about these two best remembered works in the next section of my talk. In 1882, Sarah Anne Curzon published a one-act comedy called The Sweet Girl Graduate. She wrote it at the request of the editor of Grip magazine, one of the publications that I mentioned earlier. The Sweet Girl Graduate tells the story of a young woman named Kate Bloggs who poses as a man so she can get a university education. This fictional character takes on a male identity and even dresses like a man in order to earn a university degree. Her scheme works, and she eventually graduates with top honors. The idea of a woman presenting herself as a man was, of course, intentionally provocative back in the 1882. We've already talked a little bit about how poorly Emily Stowe and Jenny Trout were treated when they tried to go to university, and they never even pretended to be anything other than women. Needless to say, the ideal of femininity was much more strongly established and expected back in the 1880s. Women were supposed to dress and look a certain way, and they were also expected to act accordingly. Women wore all those clothes, dresses, and corsets, and petticoats, and parasols, but they were also expected to project the kind of behavior that went along with it. Curzon's idea of a heroine who dressed as a man while trying to do something as unladylike as going to university would have caused a stir in 1882. But that was exactly the point behind The Sweet Girl Graduate. The controversial images of a woman dressing as a man are superficially sensationalistic, but some of the real scandals in the play come from the way it attacks how opportunities for women were restricted and the ways in which old-fashioned gender roles are portrayed as silly and arbitrary and pointless. The play opens with a monologue by the main character, Kate Bloggs, on her complaints about haughty men, vested in all the pride of place and power. This is clearly aimed at the men who have long since held power for themselves, but who would prevent women from getting an education. Kate's monologue continues with a protest about how she's prohibited from getting an education solely because of her gender. It's got nothing to do with her ability, she claims, but that forsooth, we wear the petticoat. Already, the author has drawn a comparison between male and female clothing and the symbolic power that were historically given to both. Kate's father enters the story and offers two of the traditional arguments against women getting a university education. The first is that Kate already knows enough to wed. That is to say, she presumably knows all she needs to do about cooking, cleaning, running a household, and rearing children. If a young woman has already been prepared for domestic life, for marriage, and for motherhood, why waste time and money getting her any additional education? It really would only go to waste if a woman is going to fulfill her proper, or at least her expected place as a wife and a mother. Kate's father offers an even more dangerous pitfall of women's education. If his daughter is admitted to university, she would turn the head of all the boys, meaning that getting a higher education could definitely have alarming moral or sexual repercussions. Who knows what wandering somewhere private to read alone with a boy might lead a young woman to do. The objections made by Kate's mother, Mrs. Boggs, are even stronger and more heartfelt. She asked Kate, "What'll men think of you if you go sitting down on the same benches at the colleges and studying off the same desk and like enough, for there are girls bold enough for that, out of the same books?" These arguments may seem quaint by today's standards, but back in the 1880s, many people held to the view that if a woman was progressive enough to get an education, she was probably morally progressive to do a lot of other things too. Once again, we see the perceived threat that an education could pose to a young woman's moral or sexual purity. The arguments that Kate makes to her mother are interesting. She says, "Now, Mama, you know we have gone all over this before, and she'll never agree because I think that the better educated a woman is, the better she can fulfill her home duties, especially in the care and management and health of her family and the proper training of her sons and daughters as good citizens." This seems like a surprisingly traditional argument. The feminist character and the feminist author who created her seem to be saying that by getting a good education, a young woman might only be further fulfilling the domestic roles that society has automatically assigned to her. But this was a tactic that a lot of Victorian era feminists used. They often shifted tactics depending on their audience. Sometimes women activists used more modest arguments to appease those who still saw a woman's primary role as a wife and a mother. Sarah Anne Curzon's character Kate also had rebuttals for the arguments that education might turn her into some kind of wild, loose sexual libertine. She tells her mother, "Well, Mama, I think the real shame, as you'd call it, is that you and other ladies will allow your daughters to go about to picnics, parties with any man who happens to ask them. And yet you see nothing but impropriety in my desire to attend college." The message here was clear. There was still an expectation that women would marry, procreate, and have children. But women were beginning to demand autonomy and the right to make their own life choices. This point was made even more clearly when Kate's character announces that she doesn't even really ever intend to get married at all. At the end of the day, at the end of the play, Kate graduates with honors, but still must go back to her female form to make a final point about the unfairness of arbitrary gender limitations. She describes the glamorous costume that she'll wear when her true identity is revealed at her coming out. She reconstructs her female self with an excessive degree of feminine apparel. "Not a button less than 40 on the glove," she says, as she sends schoolboys out to gather flowers for her gender reveal party. Kate seems almost enthusiastic to go back to life as a woman, until she laments how her return to womanhood would have her trapped like a hothouse flower. So Curzon's play lampoons the restrictions put on women by colorfully illustrating how well a woman might succeed if her gender wasn't an issue. The play portrays women as being just as capable of intellect and just as able to make their own life choices as any of their male counterparts. The play met with a lot of criticism, of course, both for its feminine ideals and for the imagery of a woman who defiantly dresses like a man. In 1882, the vast majority of people in Toronto, well over 95% of the population, identified as Christian. And the idea of gender swapping was directly forbidden by Christian teaching. But some people applauded the messages in Sarah Anne Curzon's The Sweet Girl Graduate. Even though it was fiction, the play might even have inspired a young woman named Emma Stanton Mellish to enroll here at the University of Trinity College, which I mentioned earlier. When Mellish tried to enroll at Trinity about a year after Curzon's play was published in 1882, she used a man's name to apply. She graduated from Trinity with a Bachelor of Music degree in 1886. Curzon's play even put pressure on the provincial government. On October the 2nd, 1884, about 2 years after the play was published, Ontario finally passed an order in council that allowed women to enroll here at University College at the University of Toronto. The struggle for gender equality in education would carry on for generations, but Sarah Anne Curzon had helped to get it started. The other major written work that Sarah Anne Curzon is remembered for is a drama in verse called Laura Secord, the heroine of 1812. It was published in 1887, although Curzon claimed that she'd written it in 1876. She blamed a lack of interest in Canadian literature for the reason that it didn't get published for over a decade after she'd written it. Most people are probably at least a little bit familiar with the legend of Laura Secord and how she became a heroine during the War of 1812. On the evening of June the 21st, 1813, she overheard plans for a surprise attack by American soldiers. They were planning on overwhelming British troops that were led by this man, Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon, at a place called Beaver Dams, which is in the Niagara Peninsula, south of St. Catharines on Lake Erie. Laura Secord knew that Fitzgibbon needed to hear of these American plans. Her husband, James, was a soldier, but he had been seriously injured at the Battle of Queenston Heights about 8 months earlier. Since James Secord was still recovering from his wounds, it was up to Laura Secord to carry the news. She walked 32 kilometers or 20 miles until she arrived at the camp of a group of Indigenous Mohawk warriors. They took her the rest of the way to Fitzgibbon's headquarters. Laura Secord reported everything she'd overheard to James Fitzgibbon and brought him the news just in time. Fitzgibbon then led a small British force and an even larger number of Indigenous warriors who were able to defeat the Americans, most of whom were either killed or captured at the Battle of Beaver Dams on June the 24th, 1813. Now, we can fast forward to about 75 years later when Sarah Anne Curzon's play about Laura Secord was published in 1817. By that time, a lot of people had actually forgotten about Laura Secord's contributions to the war effort. Laura Secord wasn't even mentioned in the military reports that were written immediately after the battle in 1813. This Canadian icon had slipped into obscurity. But Sarah Anne Curzon wrote her play to earn back some of the recognition that she felt Laura Secord deserved. Curzon said that she wanted to rescue from oblivion the name of a brave woman and set its proper place among the heroes of Canadian history. Curzon was successful in this goal. Her play sparked a lot of interest in Laura Secord, and it helped to raise funds for monuments to Laura Secord like this one at Queenston Heights. The play resulted in a flood of new articles on Laura Secord that filled out Canadian history in school textbooks. But Curzon had other motives too. She wanted to raise awareness for Laura Secord, her husband James, and other veterans of the War of 1812. Some of these veterans were still living when Curzon wrote her play in the 1870s, and some of them lived in very threadbare financial conditions. Curzon used her work to rally support for the ongoing debate about getting a bigger pension for these veterans. And of course, Curzon used her play about Laura Secord to further her own ideas on feminism. This was different than her work on The Sweet Girl Graduate. It wasn't as overt or sensationalistic, and yet Curzon used the real-life story of Laura Secord to highlight the inequity in how differently men and women were perceived. One quote in the play has Laura Secord speaking to her husband as she leaves him at home with his infirmities just before she sets out for her dangerous mission. Secord says, "Then will you taste a woman's common lot in times of strait, while I essay a man's role of fierce activity." The message was plain. It had mostly always been men who went off to fight and who faced mortal dangers. The women stayed at home, where all they could really do is worry if their fathers and husbands and sons and brothers would come home alive and in one piece. But Laura Secord's story saw a real life gender role reversal. Her husband, James, the soldier, was now the injured one, the weaker one. He had to stay at home and worry about his wife. She was the one who was now risking the hazards of war to try to provide safety for their family. The rest of the play is full of other similar discussions between its characters. In the play, Laura Secord's family and neighbors all engage in conversations about the roles of women and whether a woman can really be as strong and courageous and full of valor as a man. Sarah Anne Curzon successfully took one of Canada's legendary women out of the pages of history and turned her into a feminist symbol. And yet, Curzon maintained her historical integrity. Several reviewers praised her for her thorough research into the life of Laura Secord and the copious historical notes that she published alongside the play about the historical Canadian heroine. One source thanked Curzon for providing something for her Canadian public which shall possess a lasting and tangible value. In fact, it was Sarah Anne Curzon's involvement in history that first led me to really learn more about her. In 1895, she became the first president of a newly formed organization called the Women's Canadian Historical Society of Toronto. This society brilliantly combined Curzon's passion for promoting Canadian history with her desire to demonstrate all the intelligence and leadership that women were capable of. Curzon established the society at a time when local community groups were leading the way in promoting Canada's history. Now, this is a contemporary photograph of the Royal Ontario Museum. Although the building has changed quite dramatically over the years, I guess that this museum might be where a lot of us in Toronto had our first experiences with institutional professional history. But the Royal Ontario Museum was not established until 1912, and this is what the very first wing of the museum looked like. Back when Curzon established the Women's Canadian Historical Society of Toronto in 1895, there really wasn't much government support for museums or historical preservation anywhere in Canada, even in big cities like Toronto. This photograph shows the members of another historical organization called the York Pioneer and Historical Society. It was founded all the way back in 1869, which makes it 26 years older than Curzon's group, and in fact, one of the oldest historical societies in Canada. But let's take a closer look at the photograph. If we do, it reveals why women like Sarah Anne Curzon might have some conceptual difficulties with groups like the York Pioneers. Before Curzon set up her historical society in 1895, just about all of the other historical societies in Canada were run by men. Now, if you look closely, you can see some women standing near the back of this picture. Clubs like the York Pioneers did allow some women to be members, but they were mostly in second-class supporting roles. Sarah Anne Curzon has established herself as a well-respected Canadian historian, and was dismayed by this inadequate representation of women in the field of history. That's why her and her fellow members founded the Women's Canadian Historical Society. They wanted to preserve and promote Canadian history, but they also wanted to prove that they were just as capable as their male counterparts. What did this society do? Well, they held monthly meetings where members presented papers that they had written on various aspects of Canadian history. The best of these were reprinted in the Society's magazine, which was called Transactions. The Society also took an interest in collecting and preserving smaller artifacts. These are some of the domestic heirlooms that they saved and put on display. Society members showed off these items at historical exhibitions at places like the Canadian National Exhibition and at the University of Toronto. Other women took over Sarah Anne Curzon and her work when she died in 1898. One of these was Sarah Mickle, who served as president from 1915 until her death in 1930. She led the society in some of its larger projects to save Toronto's heritage. These projects included stopping plans from the early 1900s that would have brought a new streetcar line and a brand new real estate development right through historic Fort York. Mickle and her fellow society members not only saved the fort, but they also sponsored public lectures and children's activities on the grounds of Fort York. Sarah Mickle then spent most of the 1920s heading the Historical Society and pressuring the city's government to restore a historic home called Coburn Lodge. This cottage, which is located at the south end of Hyde Park, had once been the home of an historic Toronto couple named John and Jemima Howard. The Howards made a lot of contributions to Toronto. John Howard was one of the city's first professional architects and engineers. He designed dozens of buildings around southern Ontario, and he also put in some of Toronto's first sidewalks and sewers. John and Jemima Howard also helped to build up the city's early artistic life by hosting some of Toronto's first public art exhibitions in their own home, and ultimately they bequeathed their land to become Hyde Park. All these years later, it's still enjoyed by tens of thousands of people every year. The Howard's home at Coburn Lodge was also part of the Howard's legacy. After John and Jemima died, the house was left abandoned and neglected, but Sarah Mickle researched, wrote, and presented papers on the Howards and Coburn Lodge. Along with her fellow female historians in the Women's Canadian Historical Society of Toronto, she pressured Toronto City Council to restore Coburn Lodge as a museum. Coburn Lodge opened as a museum in 1927, and the City of Toronto still operates it as a public museum to this day. One of her fellow society members wrote of Sarah Mickle, "I am sure that the people of Toronto will never appreciate the work and thought Miss Mickle put into Howard House." She looked after everything from the drains to having Mrs. Howard's feather flowers cleaned. Now, I don't know if you've ever visited Coburn Lodge Museum, but I'll confess that I have a special interest in the building's history. I work occasionally at Coburn Lodge, and I'm always immensely grateful for the work that some of Toronto's leading women, like Sarah Anne Curzon, Sarah Mickle, and so many others, put into forming a group of civic-minded historians. These women studied and salvaged and nurtured Toronto's history, and they've left it for those of us living today to continue their work. And yet these women who were part of the Women's Canadian Historical Society were sometimes written off as only being amateur historians and housewives. They didn't just chronicle a lot of Canadian history, though, they completely resurrected it. They lived up to Sarah Anne Curzon's belief that historical activism was a means by which women could assert a collective civic identity as citizens. Now, Sarah Anne Curzon used history, literature, and the written word to promote the equitable treatment of women. We can contrast this to the massive and sometimes violent suffragette rallies that took place in countries like Great Britain and the United States. Suffragettes often clashed with police in Great Britain and Ireland, where they carried out a campaign of bombing and arson between 1912 and 1914. At least 5 people were killed, including 1 suffragette, and another 24 people were injured, including 2 suffragettes. Suffragettes down in the United States also typically relied on peaceful tactics like protesting, but sometimes they were physically attacked. And in 1917, 33 of them were arrested while picketing outside the American White House. The oldest woman to be detained was 73 years old. The women's suffrage movement in Canada was much less militant, especially when we think of the work that Victorian-era feminists like Sarah Anne Curzon engaged in. She used her intellect, her education, and her writing to promote the perception that women really could be intelligent, and that women deserved autonomy over their own lives and their own bodies, including the right to vote, the choice of an education and a career, or the right to own their own property, so that they could have some independent financial security. Sarah Anne Curzon died on November the 6th, 1898. She was only about 65 years old at the time of her passing. Her death was attributed to Bright's disease, an illness that affects the kidneys. She was buried alongside her husband, Robert, and near their one daughter, Florence Elizabeth. The Curzons don't even really have a proper tombstone, just these three markers in Plot C, Section 14, Lot 13 of Mount Pleasant Cemetery. And yet Sarah Anne Curzon has left behind an enduring legacy. Maybe one of the most valuable parts of this was to chronicle Canadian history by describing it through the experiences and perspectives of a few notable women. We see this most strongly through the play that she wrote about Laura Secord. But one thing that I've discovered in putting together so many biographical sketches of Canadian historical characters is that so much of our history is written from a male perspective, by and about men. And the life story of Sarah Anne Curzon herself, drawn from the second half of the 1800s, is a rare early example of a well-documented historical woman. Most of the information I found out about her gave very limited information about her husband, Robert. In one way, this was frustrating because I like to know the whole story, and facts about her marriage might have shed some light on the rest of her life. And yet it made for an interesting change too. It seems that Sarah Anne Curzon was an early example of a Canadian woman who was, at last, the center of her own story. Now, of course, I realize that Sarah Anne Curzon never fought on the battlefield or plotted any rebellions. She wasn't a captain of industry, a business tycoon, or a prominent politician, but she did fight for change and equality, and in her own significant way, she helped to revolutionize the society that she lived in. So I hope that you found her story to be of interest.